There is a moment when a man stops grieving and starts counting. Not counting his losses, though those were considerable. Not counting the years, the arguments, the small surrenders that had accumulated like unpaid interest on a debt he never agreed to carry. No, this was a different kind of counting, methodical, quiet. The kind that happens when a man realizes the storm has already passed through the house and taken everything it wanted, and what remains is not ruin, but clarity. Marcus Hale reached that moment on a Tuesday evening in late October, sitting at the kitchen table of the house he had spent 11 years paying for, looking at a printout of 6 credit card statements arranged side by side, like the pages of a case file. The numbers were organized neatly in a column he had made himself, a spreadsheet, because that is who Marcus Hale was, an architect who believed that every problem, properly measured, could eventually be solved. The total at the bottom of that column was $214,000. The column beside it, the one that mattered more than the dollar amount, showed the dates the charges were made. Nearly all of them fell within a 14-day window. 14 days. While he had been in Portland on a project deadline, his wife of 9 years had been home in Chicago, and she had been very, very busy. He looked at the column one more time, ran his finger down the numbers, the way he ran his finger down a structural calculation, not to change anything, but to confirm he had read it correctly. Then he picked up his phone and called the bank. Before we get into what happened next, and I promise you, what happened next is worth every minute of your time. If you are new here, take a second and hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it tells the story that this content matters. And if you are watching from somewhere across the country or around the world right now, drop your city in the comments below. I genuinely love knowing where this community reaches. Now, let us go back to the beginning, because the ending only lands the way it deserves to land if you understand what Marcus Hale built over the course of his life and what Diane Hale decided she was going to take apart. Marcus had grown up in Cleveland, the son of a structural engineer who measured everything twice and trusted nothing that had not been tested under actual load. His father was a quiet, precise man who wore the same style of work boots for 30 years and spoke in complete sentences even when he was tired, and who had a particular philosophy about failure that he repeated often enough that Marcus eventually stopped hearing it as a saying and started hearing it as a law of nature. A building does not fail on the day the crack appears, his father used to say. It fails on the day someone sees the crack and decides not to mention it. Marcus had grown up understanding this, not as a metaphor, but as a literal truth about material science, and he had applied it to bridges, and to commercial developments, and to the mid-rise residential projects that had over 15 years of practice made his firm one of the more respected small practices in Chicago. He had also, for 9 years, applied it to his marriage, patching the cracks he saw, smoothing over tensions before they could propagate, reinforcing the structure every time he felt it shift beneath him. He had believed, with the particular and possibly willful optimism of a man who had spent his career building things designed to outlast him, that commitment was fundamentally an engineering problem. That if you put in the work, if you paid attention to the load-bearing elements, if you caught the failures early and addressed them honestly, the structure would hold. He had been wrong about that. Not about the engineering. The engineering had been right. He had been wrong about the material. Diane had come into his life at a dinner party when Marcus was 31, still in the years when the practice was more aspiration than income, still eating at the kind of restaurants where the ambition of the food outpaced the ability of the room to contain it. She was charming and beautiful, quick with a laugh that made a room turn toward her, and she moved through social spaces the way certain people do when they have been told all their lives that rooms rearrange themselves to accommodate them. She had grown up with money, not the kind of money that makes the news, but the comfortable, insulating kind that quietly removes consequence from most of the important decisions. Her parents had a house in Winnetka and a timeshare in Scottsdale, and the particular worldview that develops in people who have never had to choose between two things they both wanted, because the answer had always been both. Diane had absorbed all of it without being aware of absorbing it, the way people absorb the architecture of the house they grow up in. She was not malicious about it. She was not calculating in those early years. She simply had no authentic framework for limitation, because limitation had never genuinely applied to her. In the early years of the marriage, Marcus had found her relationship with abundance intoxicating in the way that a careful person can be intoxicated by someone who is genuinely unafraid. She did not lie awake, calculating margins. She did not second-guess purchases or rehearse justifications. She spent money on beautiful things, and the apartment felt alive with texture and color and the specific buoyant energy of someone who believed that the natural state of the universe was generosity toward those willing to receive it. He had told himself this was balance. He was the precise one. She was the expressive one. Architecture and decoration, structure and style. He had believed, for a while, that this was what a partnership looked like when two people's native abilities genuinely complemented each other. The practice grew, slowly at first, then with the kind of momentum that caught even Marcus off guard, because he had been conservative in his projections the way his father had taught him to be conservative in his calculations. By their 5th anniversary, the firm employed 14 people, carried 3 ongoing commercial contracts, and had developed a reputation for the kind of clean, quiet, precise work that attracted serious clients who cared about buildings that would still be standing correctly in 30 years. The money followed, not extravagantly, not overnight, but steadily in the way that things built on good foundations tend to accumulate value over time. Plus, they bought the house in Lincoln Park, 4 bedrooms, a back garden with mature trees, the kind of structural bones that Marcus could read like a language, and that Diane loved because it photographed beautifully for the dinner parties she had begun hosting with increasing frequency and increasing ambition. They renovated it over 2 years, Marcus drawing every plan himself, making each structural decision personally, walking through the space on weekends with a level and a notebook, and the deep satisfaction of a man improving something he owned. The house cost something close to $1 million when the renovation was fully settled. He paid for it methodically, the way he did everything, and he put it in both their names because that was what you did when you were committed to a person and you believed the structure was sound. What Marcus did not see, or perhaps chose not to fully examine, was the way Diane's spending had begun to scale alongside the income in a manner that felt natural in each individual moment, but was, viewed over time, a slow and steady structural drift. The dinner parties became more elaborate, catered eventually, with hired staff, and a florist and a wine selection that required actual research. The wardrobe became a serious annual expense. There were spa memberships and a personal trainer and a subscription wine service that cost more per month than Marcus's first studio apartment had cost in rent. There were gifts to friends, to her parents, to herself, always framed in the language of investment, in relationships, in wellness, in the kind of careful self-presentation that Diane considered not vanity, but professional necessity, since she moved in circles where these things were noticed. There were renovation additions she proposed for the house, a designer kitchen backsplash imported from a workshop in Portugal, new windows in the master bedroom, landscaping work that ultimately cost $40,000 and involved a woman with a hyphenated last name who described the placement of shrubs in the language of intentions and spatial energy. Marcus had absorbed all of it. Because the money was there. Because he loved her. Because he had told himself that a marriage, like a building, required sustained investment in the early decades in order to deliver stability in the decades that followed. He had been wrong about that, too. Not about the investment. The investment had been real. He had been wrong about what the investment meant to Diane, What he had experienced as generosity, she had experienced as permission. What he had experienced as partnership, she had experienced as access. And what Marcus would come to understand, slowly and then all at once, was that Diane had never fully shared his belief that the structure was worth maintaining. She had simply been making a different kind of calculation, one that concerned itself less with what the house was built on and more with what could be carried out the door. The first sign that Marcus could identify in retrospect, truly identify, not just absorb and file away as a moment of friction to be addressed later, came approximately 8 months before the Portland trip. He had come home from a site visit in the early evening to find Diane at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a glass of wine at her elbow. That was clearly not her first. There had been a quality to her silence when he walked in that he recognized immediately. Not guilt. Guilt has a restlessness to it, a tendency to fill space with explanation. This was something more studied. The practiced stillness of someone who has made a decision and is waiting to see whether the decision will be discovered or whether it can continue undisturbed. He had asked how her day was. She had answered briefly. He had sat down across from her and waited because Marcus understood that patience in a structure is not weakness, but capacity. And eventually, she had said, almost casually, that she had been thinking about whether they were really aligned anymore, whether they wanted the same things, whether Marcus truly understood what she needed from a partner. The words had been careful in the way that prepared words are careful, smoothed and shaped in advance, load-tested for plausibility. And Marcus had felt something cold move through the kitchen that had nothing to do with the weather. He had not panicked. He had asked questions, the way he always did, measured, focused on understanding the shape of the problem before proposing any solution. She had talked for an hour, circling a central point she never quite arrived at, using the language of emotional needs and personal growth and compatibility with the fluency of someone who had been rehearsing the vocabulary for longer than the conversation itself had been underway. Afterward, Marcus had felt more unsettled than before, but he had taken her at her word that the conversation had been valuable, that they were working on something together, that the talking itself was the work. He had made a note. A crack in the wall, he would watch it. Over the months that followed, there were other signs, and he watched them with the careful attention of a man who has been trained to notice material change before it becomes material failure. Diane became less communicative about her schedule. She took more weekend trips, to New York once, to a friend's house in Michigan twice, described in terms vague enough to discourage detailed questions, and from which she returned with a bright, contained energy that Marcus associated, in his experience of people, with someone who is working very hard not to think about something specific. She became more critical of small things in the marriage, the hours Marcus kept, the professional dinners he attended, the way he organized the kitchen, the fact that he sometimes worked on Saturday mornings. The criticisms had the quality of constructed grievances assembled, not to solve a problem, but to build a record, to create a narrative of neglect that could later be pointed to as context. Marcus had felt all of it. He had not named it aloud, because he did not want to be the kind of man who tears down a structure because he thinks he sees a crack. He wanted measurement. He wanted evidence. He was, as always, patient. The Portland project was one of the largest commissions his firm had ever received. A mixed-use development on the waterfront. A client who had chosen Marcus's practice specifically for its reputation for structural integrity, and a timeline that required him to be on site for 3 weeks in October. He had kissed Diane goodbye on a Sunday morning, noted her distracted warmth, and flown west with 2 laptops and a rolled set of drawings. He called her every evening for the first 4 days, and she answered, and the conversations were normal in a way that now struck him, in retrospect, as almost theatrical in its normalcy, the practiced sound of things being fine. By the 5th day, she was letting the calls go to voicemail. By the middle of the 2nd week, she was responding to his texts with 2 or 3 words that conveyed the minimum possible information while technically constituting a reply. He had told himself she was going through something. He had told himself that when he got home, he would sit with her properly, without a deadline in his peripheral vision, and find out what the structure actually needed. He had focused on the building and trusted that the marriage, whatever its current condition, would hold until he could get back to it. He had been in Portland for 18 days when the first credit card alert arrived on his phone at 11 o'clock at night. A single charge, $11,000 at a furniture and home goods retailer on Chicago's Gold Coast. He had stared at the notification for a long time, longer than it takes to read 11 words, before he called Diane. The call went to voicemail. He texted. She replied, 45 minutes later, that she had found a wonderful vintage dealer, that the pieces were extraordinary, that he would love them. $11,000 was not furniture for a guest room. $11,000 was a declaration. He had pulled up the account online, scrolled through the recent activity with his thumb, and that was the moment the world stopped making the sound it normally made. In 18 days, Diane had charged $214,000 across their joint credit cards. There were 6 cards in total. 3 had been taken to their limits. 2 were within a few $1,000s of their ceilings. The 6th, a card Marcus used almost exclusively for his firm's business expenses, carried a charge from 2 days earlier, $40,000 to a family law firm whose name Marcus recognized immediately, because everyone in Chicago's professional and social class recognized that name. It was the firm you hired when you intended to make sure the person on the other side of the table understood from the first document that crossed it that you had arrived, fully prepared and fully funded. Marcus Hales sat in his hotel room in Portland, Oregon, and did not make a sound for 11 minutes. He knew this because there was a clock on the wall above the desk, and he watched it without intending to, the way a person watches something neutral when their mind is occupied with something too large to look at directly. He thought about the house in Lincoln Park, and the 9 years, and the $11,000 furniture charge that had been the first visible piece of something much larger. He thought about the crack in the wall he had first noticed 8 months ago, and about all the signs he had chosen in the months since to read as solvable rather than as evidence. He thought about his father's voice, steady and precise, saying a building does not fail on the day the crack appears. And then Marcus Hale stopped grieving and started counting. He opened his laptop. He pulled up every card account and went through each one systematically, cataloging every charge made in the past 30 days by date, amount, and merchant category. He built the spreadsheet with the same care he brought to a structural calculation. Because the spreadsheet was a structural document, it was the record of what had happened and what could be proven and what could be used. The charges fell into 3 clear categories. First, high-end home goods and furnishings, most of which had been delivered to the house, and some of which, as he would later discover, had been redirected to a storage facility. Second, personal luxury items, jewelry from 2 retailers whose names Marcus recognized as establishments, whose receipts come in embossed envelopes, clothing from boutiques at price points that made the amounts legible as choices rather than oversights. Third, the legal retainer, $40,000, which was in a category by itself, because it was not a purchase, it was a strategy. It told Marcus everything he needed to know about the timeline Diane had been operating on, which was considerably longer than 14 days. The heavy spending had been the final phase of a plan that had been in construction for months. The Portland trip had been the window she had been waiting for, a defined period of his absence, long enough to complete what needed to be completed, far enough away to limit his immediate response. He had to give her credit for the architecture. It was, from a purely structural standpoint, well designed. Use the joint accounts because the debt becomes shared on paper. Make no attempt to conceal the charges from the statements because concealment creates criminal exposure, while open spending creates civil ambiguity. Create a large joint debt at the precise moment a divorce filing begins, because in the chaos of contested proceedings, that debt becomes a negotiating weight, a financial compression that limits liquidity during the period when liquidity matters most. It was not impulsive, it was not emotional, it was a plan, but Diane had made a mistake. A specific structural mistake of the kind that is woven into a person's character rather than their planning, and therefore nearly impossible to design around. She had assumed that Marcus would do what he had always done: absorb the information, measure the damage carefully, and wait for the ideal moment to address it. She had mistaken his deliberateness for slowness. She had misread his patience as a kind of paralysis, the frozen quality of a man who would not act until he had consulted everyone and considered everything and arrived at a response so measured it had lost its timeliness. She had forgotten, or perhaps never truly understood, what his father had actually been teaching him all those years. A building does not fail on the day the crack appears. It fails on the day someone sees the crack and decides not to mention it. Marcus had learned that lesson, not as a metaphor for caution, but as a mandate for speed. When you identify an active failure in a load-bearing wall, you do not wait for the optimal moment. You act immediately to prevent further collapse. Marcus Hale called the bank. The call lasted 40 minutes. He spoke to 3 different representatives, each with increasing authority, and he was calm throughout, in the way that people are calm when a decision has been made so completely that anxiety simply has no more room in them. He described the situation with precision and without drama. He described the charges. He noted the pattern and the timeline. He used the specific language required. He asked for 3 specific things: the immediate suspension of all charging privileges on every joint account, the flagging of the recent large transactions for formal review, and the preservation of complete records for all account activity going back 18 months. The bank representative on the 3rd and final call, a woman named Patricia, who had the measured voice of someone who has heard a great many versions of a great many stories and is rarely surprised by any of them, listened to everything without interruption. Then she said quietly that she understood and would process his requests immediately. She also said something Marcus had not expected, something that he wrote down in the margin of the spreadsheet printout as soon as she said it. The $40,000 charge to the law firm had been declined on its first attempt 2 days before it ultimately went through. Diane had called the bank, identified herself as the account holder, described the decline as an error, and been granted a temporary limit increase to accommodate the charge. A temporary limit increase granted over the phone on the basis of a claim of error. Marcus wrote those words down carefully. Then he booked a flight home for the following morning. Diane was not at the house when Marcus arrived. He had not called ahead. He let himself in through the front door with his key and stood in the entry hall for a moment, taking in the changed geometry of the space. Several pieces of furniture he had never seen before were positioned throughout the main floor with the deliberate casualness of someone staging a room to look naturally inhabited. Along the living room wall, there were boxes, sealed, labeled in Diane's handwriting, organized by category. The labels identified items she had brought into the marriage or acquired during it. She had been packing selectively, methodically, in the way a person packs when they are preparing for a version of departure that needs to present well in a legal context. Marcus walked through the house slowly, the way he walked through a building under construction, not as the person who lived there, but as the person responsible for understanding what its current condition actually was. He noted every change. He photographed every room. He went to the home office and opened the fireproof cabinet, where he kept backup copies of all financial records, tax returns going back to before the marriage, account statements, investment records, the ownership documents for the firm. The drive was still there. The cabinet had been opened recently. The order of the folders had been disturbed in a way that was subtle but legible to him, but nothing had been removed. He also retrieved the original deed to the house, the purchase documents, and the full record of the mortgage payments he had made, which were in his name alone as a consequence of the financing structure they had used at the time of purchase. Diane had agreed to this arrangement without significant interest in the details, because at the time the details had not seemed to her to matter. He called Elliot Cho from the home office, standing at the window that looked out over the back garden, the mature trees bare in the October cold. Elliot was the corporate attorney who had handled the firm's contracts for 6 years, a quiet, unhurried man who had the quality of someone who exists specifically to prevent other people from making expensive and irreversible mistakes. Elliot listened to the full summary without speaking, and, when Marcus finished, the first thing Elliot said was, "You called the bank last night?" Marcus said, "Yes." Elliot said, "Good. That was the right move. Don't touch anything in the house except documents that are demonstrably yours. Photograph everything else, and give me the name of her firm." Marcus gave him the name. There was a brief silence on Elliot's end, the kind of silence that is itself a form of information. And then Elliot said, "Okay, I'm going to make some calls this morning. We need to get ahead of this before anything is filed." Diane arrived home at 4 in the afternoon. She came in through the side entrance, off the kitchen, carrying shopping bags whose tissue paper contents were visible at the top. And she stopped completely when she saw Marcus at the kitchen table with his laptop open and the printed spreadsheet in front of him. But she was wearing a coat he had never seen, camel-colored, expensive, clearly recent. The expression that crossed her face in the half-second before she composed it was one Marcus filed away with precision. It was not guilt. Guilt is involuntary and shows itself before it can be managed. What crossed Diane's face was calculation, the rapid, practiced assessment of which version of the conversation she was now in and how best to enter it. "You're home early," she said. "I am," Marcus said. She set the bags down on the counter with a deliberateness that bought her 3 seconds, and she removed the coat with the unhurried poise of someone who understands that the speed at which you perform ordinary actions communicates something to the room. "I wasn't expecting you until next week," she said. "I know," Marcus said. "Sit down, Diane." She sat, not because he had asked her to, but because standing would have required a choice about whether to leave the room. And leaving the room would have been a concession that neither of them could walk back. She arranged her face into the expression Marcus recognized from the conversation 8 months ago in this same kitchen, the practiced, survivable stillness of someone who has decided that whatever is coming can be endured as long as she does not initiate it. He slid the spreadsheet across the table. She looked at it without touching it, the way people look at evidence they have already decided to dispute. $214,000, Marcus said, in 30 days. On accounts that carry both our names. Marcus, I'm not asking you to explain it, he said, and his voice had the quality of a measured thing, precise and without heat. I don't need an explanation. I need you to understand what has already happened so that whatever conversation we have from here begins from an accurate picture of the facts. She looked at him with an expression that was attempting contempt and not quite achieving it. The contempt was undermined by the effort required to produce it. I've consulted with an attorney. I have rights in this marriage. And you do, Marcus said, and I called the bank 2 nights ago and had all charging privileges suspended on every joint account. The recent transactions have been formally flagged for review. The temporary limit increase that was used to process the retainer payment has been escalated as a separate matter. And I spoke with Elliot Cho yesterday, who spent his morning in conversation with a family law specialist, reviewing the timeline of these charges in the context of what is, I'm told, referred to in Illinois as dissipation of marital assets, which is a characterization that courts here take a specific and consistently unfavorable view of. The room became very quiet. Outside, through the kitchen window, a neighbor's dog was barking at something in the middle distance, and the afternoon light came through the glass at a low October angle, laying a clean line across the table between them, illuminating the edge of the spreadsheet where it sat in the space that had once been ordinary and was now something else entirely. Diane's face moved through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, then recalculation, then the harder, more set quality that Marcus recognized as the moment a person stops negotiating and begins positioning. "You're trying to intimidate me," she said. "I'm giving you accurate information," Marcus said. "Those are different things, and I think you know that. My attorney will contact yours, and we can handle this through the proper—" "Your attorney," Marcus said, "was paid with a charge that is currently under review as part of a documented pattern of spending that occurred during a period when you had, by every available indicator, already decided privately that this marriage was ending. That creates a specific legal question about whether those marital funds were used appropriately to retain counsel for an action against your spouse. I'm not a lawyer, and I won't pretend to know exactly how that question resolves. But Elliot is a lawyer, and the family law specialist he spoke with this morning says it's a question worth raising formally." Diane looked at the spreadsheet. She looked at the bags on the counter, at the tissue paper visible at the top, at the beautiful and expensive things she had continued acquiring as recently as this afternoon. She looked at Marcus with an expression that had moved past positioning into something quieter and more unguarded. The expression of someone who has arrived at a plan's edge and found the ground shorter than the plan had promised. "What do you want?" she said. It was 4 words, but 4 words that only get spoken when a person has recognized that the conversation they prepared for is not the conversation that is actually happening. Marcus had spent the flight home from Portland and the long, solitary night in the Lincoln Park house and the careful morning hours reviewing documents and speaking with Elliot, deciding what he wanted. Not in the heat of injury. He had moved past that. Somewhere over the Rockies at 35,000 feet, watching the dark land below and understanding that the grief of it was real and that the grief did not govern his decisions. He had decided what a fair outcome looked like and what he was willing to do to secure it, and, equally importantly, what he was not willing to do because of who he was and who he intended to remain through this and after it. "I want a fair process," he said. "I want the debt on those accounts addressed honestly in any settlement, because those charges were not made jointly in any meaningful sense of the word, and they were not made in good faith. I want the house treated according to the actual financial record, which shows clearly who paid for it and on what terms. And I want this resolved without years of litigation that costs both of us money we should not be spending and leaves both of us smaller and harder than we were when we started. I don't want a war, Diane. I never wanted a war. And if I don't agree to your terms, then we let the legal process proceed," Marcus said, "and the process will have the spreadsheet and the bank records and the timeline and the documentation of the limit increase and Elliot and a family law specialist who has a considered and detailed opinion about the retainer charge. None of those things require your agreement to exist. They exist now. I'm offering you the choice to be part of a resolution rather than the subject of a proceeding. That's a different position to be in, and I think you know it." The neighbor's dog had gone quiet. The kitchen held the particular stillness of a room in which something has just shifted its weight permanently, and both people present can feel it. Marcus sat inside the silence, without filling it, because he had learned, a long time ago, in rooms where structures were being decided, that silence belongs to whoever is most comfortable inside it. Diane looked at the table. She picked up her phone, held it for a moment with both hands as though testing its weight, and then set it back down. "I need to speak to my attorney," she said. "Take whatever time you need," Marcus said. "I'll be here." She stood, gathered her coat and the shopping bags, with their expensive, tissue-wrapped contents, and walked out of the kitchen. He heard her footsteps on the stairs, measured, controlled, the sound of someone maintaining a posture. He heard the bedroom door close, and Marcus Hales sat alone at the kitchen table in the house he had designed and paid for and renovated with his own drawings. In the city he had built a practice in, and he breathed, and he let the weight of the moment be what it was without trying to move it anywhere. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing about the end of a 9-year marriage is simple, regardless of how clear the financial picture or how capable the attorneys. There were difficult conversations conducted through intermediaries and more difficult silences conducted in person, and there was a period of 2 weeks during which Diane moved in with a close friend and Marcus lived alone in the Lincoln Park house with the sealed boxes along the living room wall and the unfamiliar furniture and the very particular quality of stillness that settles into a space that is waiting to be reclassified. He did not find this period easy or clean or vindicating in the ways that people sometimes imagine vindication feels. He had loved Diane, loved the version of her he had assembled from 9 years of evidence, loved the marriage he had believed they were building together, and the grief of losing even a thing that had not been fully real was still grief, and it moved through him in its own time and did not ask his permission. He did not try to argue himself out of it. He did not schedule it away or drown it in the work, though the work was there in abundance and its rhythms were familiar and deeply comforting. He let himself feel what there was to feel in the evenings and the early mornings, and then he got up each day and went back to the careful, exacting business of building things that would last. Elliot, working alongside a family law specialist named Adrienne Watts, a woman who had the demeanor of someone who has seen every conceivable version of the situation and retained her precision and her clarity regardless, built a thorough and well-documented picture of the financial circumstances. The dissipation argument was a substantial one. Illinois courts do not look generously on a spouse who runs up significant joint debt in the immediate period preceding a divorce filing, particularly when the pattern is abrupt, large in scale, and traceable to specific high-value and largely portable items. The furniture charges, Marcus had been correct about this, included pieces that had been delivered to the house and also pieces that had been redirected to a storage facility, a logistical detail that Diane's attorney, when confronted with it, was unable to explain in terms that satisfied anyone present. The jewelry and clothing charges involved items that were, for legal purposes, personal property acquired during the marriage, which complicated but did not eliminate the dissipation characterization. The retainer charge remained the sharpest legal question in the room, and Diane's attorney handled it to her credit by proposing a modification to the overall settlement structure that effectively acknowledged the underlying impropriety without naming it in writing, a practical solution that Adrienne described afterward as the most sensible thing to come out of any session involving that particular firm in recent memory. What emerged after 3 months of careful, documented, professionally managed negotiation, not litigation, because Marcus had meant every word he said about trench warfare, was a settlement that was fair, not punishing, not designed to inflict maximum damage, not the kind of outcome that anyone in the room described as a victory. The joint card debt was allocated in a manner that reflected the actual origin and intent of the charges, with Diane accepting responsibility for the substantial majority of the balance. The house went to Marcus with a cash payment to Diane that represented her portion of the genuine appreciated equity accumulated during the marriage, calculated against the actual financial record of who had funded the purchase and the renovation, a number that was meaningful but considerably less than the 50% she might have argued for absent. Though the dissipation documentation. The personal property was divided across 3 sessions with a mediator named Gerald, who had the remarkable professional quality of making both parties feel consistently heard while moving the conversation, with gentle and inexorable momentum, toward resolution. Marcus retained full ownership of the firm, which had never been a marital asset in any serious legal sense. The ownership structure had been established years earlier with exactly this kind of protection built in, not because Marcus had been planning for divorce, but because Elliot, years ago, had told him that good structures are built before you need them, not in the moment you discover you do. When the settlement documents were ready to be signed, Marcus sat in Elliot's conference room on a Thursday morning in November with the pen in his hand and the papers in front of him, and held that moment for a few seconds before he used it. He thought about the spreadsheet and the phone call from the Portland hotel room and the flight home over the dark land. He thought about Diane at the kitchen table 8 months ago with her practiced stillness and her prepared words. He thought about the crack in the wall and the boxes along the living room wall and the coat he had never seen and the tissue paper in the bags. He thought about his father's voice, measured and certain, saying a building does not fail on the day the crack appears. And then he signed his name in the clean, precise architectural hand he had always had, unhurried, legible, committed, and he set the pen down on the table. Elliot shook his hand across the conference table. Adrienne Watts, gathering her copies, looked at him with an expression that was the professional equivalent of a nod of genuine respect, not sympathy, not pity, but the acknowledgement of one careful person by another. Marcus thanked them both, put on his coat, picked up his bag, and walked out of the building into the November air of downtown Chicago, which was cold and crystalline, and carried, as Chicago air in November always carries, the sharp and clarifying smell of the lake. He stood on the sidewalk outside the building for a moment, in no particular hurry to be anywhere. He was 43 years old. He owned a house in Lincoln Park with good bones and his own drawings inside the walls. He ran a firm with 16 employees and 3 active contracts and a reputation that had been built from nothing over 15 years and that had held steady through all of it. He had a spreadsheet that had done exactly the work it was made to do, and that could now be filed away with the other completed calculations. And he had, somewhere in the past 3 months, in the hotel room in Portland, and the long nights in the house alone, and the careful sessions in conference rooms, found out what he was made of when something he had built was taken apart around him. He had found out that he was made of the same material his father had spent a lifetime trying to teach him to work with, not invulnerability, but load capacity, not the absence of damage, but the ability to bear weight without losing form. He called Priya, his lead architect, who had been carrying the Portland project in his absence with a competence that had, on more than one occasion, made Marcus feel the particular pride of a builder whose work has outgrown him in exactly the right direction. He told her he was back, fully back. She said the Portland clients had called that morning and wanted to schedule the next site walkthrough. He said Thursday work. She said good. And then, with the easy directness of someone who has worked alongside a person long enough to know when a question is appropriate and when it will be welcomed, she asked if he was all right. He stood on the sidewalk in the November cold, in the clean air coming off the lake, and he thought about it genuinely, not in the way you think about an answer you want to give, but in the way you test a material, pressing into it honestly to see what it returns. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am." He meant it, not as a performance of recovery, not as a posture he was maintaining for professional purposes, not as the reassuring answer you offer when you want people to stop asking. He meant it the way he meant something when he had measured it carefully under real conditions and found it to be true. He was 43 years old, standing in the cold air of a city he had built something in, and he was intact. He had been honest throughout, and he had been careful throughout, and the thing inside him that his father had spent decades trying to construct correctly, the load-bearing element beneath everything else, the one that holds when the surface materials give way, had not failed. It had held. There is something worth staying with before we close, and it is not a lecture, and it is not a set of instructions. It is just a thing that Marcus would tell you himself if you found him on the right afternoon and asked the right question. The phone call to the bank was not a revenge move. It was not a power play, and it was not financial aggression, which is how Diane characterized it through her attorney in the early stages of the process. It was a man who saw structural failure occurring in real time and took the first available and appropriate action to prevent further collapse. The difference between those two characterizations matters more than it might appear to, because the difference between acting from injury and acting from clarity is the difference between a decision you spend years defending and a decision you can live with cleanly. Marcus had made the call not to punish Diane for what she had done, but to protect what he had spent 15 years building, and to do so in a way that he could look back on without revision. The discipline required to hold that distinction, under real pressure, in real pain, with real money and real history at stake, had been the most load-bearing quality he possessed throughout the entire ordeal. There will be people watching this who recognize the shape of what Marcus went through, even if the particular facts are different. The feeling of building something carefully over a long period of time and discovering that someone you trusted had been making different plans in the same space. The question of what you do in the first hours after you understand what has happened, whether you act from the wound or from the person you intend to be when the wound has healed. If Marcus's story offers anything to those people, it is probably this. The moment you understand clearly what is happening is the precise moment your options become real. Before that moment, you are waiting, absorbing, carrying weight without knowing its shape. After it, you are building something new, even if you cannot yet see the form it will take. The speed with which you move from the first state to the second is not a measure of how badly you have been hurt. It is a measure of who you have decided to be on the other side of the hurt. And that decision is yours to make in full, regardless of what has been done to you. Marcus went back to Portland on Thursday. The walkthrough took most of the afternoon. The clients had questions about the southern elevation, and there was a discussion about load distribution on the upper floor that Marcus found genuinely absorbing in the way that concrete, well-defined problems can be absorbing to a person who has recently been living inside the abstract and unresolvable. He stood in the unfinished space, with the light coming through the framed window openings and the smell of new concrete around him, and he answered the questions carefully and completely, the way he always had, and at the end of the afternoon, the lead client shook his hand and said the project was in good shape. Marcus agreed. The building, as it turned out, had very good bones. If this story landed for you, give it a like before you go. It is the single most useful thing you can do to support this channel, and it takes about 1 second of your time. And if you have been through something that tested what you were made of, something that came apart in a way you did not plan for, and you came out the other side, knowing yourself better than you did when you went in, I want to hear about it in the comments. That is what this community is built from. The stories of people who went through hard things with their integrity intact and came out standing. Tell me what happened. Tell me where you are watching from. Drop your city below and let me see how far this reaches. There is more coming, and it is worth staying for. We will see you in the next one.